Good morning. I call this meeting of the House Fraud Prevention and State Agency Oversight Committee to order. Welcome to our new time and our new room. Thanks to everyone for your flexibility as we accommodated the needs of another committee this morning. We do have a quorum, so we will move the minutes of the last meeting.
So moved.
Thank you, Vice Chair Anderson. Vice Chair Anderson moves the minutes of the March 3rd, 2025 meeting. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Minutes are approved. All right. So today we have a presentation on the overview of fraud problems in Minnesota from Bill Glahn. He's a fellow with the think tank, the Center of the American Experiment, and he has done extensive research on this over several years. And so we're happy to welcome you to the committee to share with us your findings. And if you wouldn't mind beginning by stating your name for the record.
I'm Bill Glahn with the Center of the American Experiment.
Thank you. I believe you have a slide presentation, which has disappeared since we set it up. Oh, there it is. Excellent.
Right. Trying not to be as AV intensive as my colleagues at the center. I did want to have a couple of pictures here to illustrate my discussion here of fraud, waste, and abuse in Minnesota. So one of the things that I did, this probably started a year or so ago, was trying to answer the question of how much fraud, waste, and abuse is going on and has gone on in state government. And so I put together what I call the fraud, waste, and abuse tracker, where I've looked at incidents where state government has been either defrauded or there have been incidents where people have been accused of taking money they weren't necessarily entitled to or more money than they were entitled to, and trying to come up with a bottom line number. And building off of an earlier set of work that the center did on the scandal tracker, I started with the year 2019. The previous tracker went through the year 2018. And so from 2019 until the present, we have a total, and I'll skip ahead here. I have my AV guy here to help me out. I want to move ahead one. Scroll. No, I got it. Sorry. $611 million. So $611 million is the total of, and I have 27 incidents that I've cataloged here. And of course, the biggest one is Feeding Our Future. And there's a trial going on in downtown Minneapolis. Will resume on Wednesday. It's been going on for over a month now, of the person who is accused of being the ringleader or the gatekeeper of the Feeding Our Future fraud. Her name is Amy Bach. She was the founder of a nonprofit who operated food programs through state government to feed, presumably, poor, hungry children. And the U.S. Attorney, the Department of Justice for the federal government, has accused her and her co-defendants of stealing $250 million. And this happened through largely a program operated during the COVID years, and it occurred in 2020, 2021. January 2022, we had a raid by FBI agents and Treasury agents and others. 200 federal agents descended on the Minneapolis, Twin Cities area, raided dozens of locations. And I just wanted to point out, it's taken almost 3 years to get to the point where we're having this trial of the person who is accused of running this organization. So it's a very slow process. And I know one of the questions that I'm frequently asked is how much money has been recovered? And I get this question a lot, and the answer, I've seen various accounts of it, between 50 million, 60 million, maybe even $66 million of the 250 million have been recovered and returned to, in this case, federal taxpayers, which, if you can do the math, is only a fraction of the total amount involved in the fraud. A couple of other things I want to point out about the fraud is that this was the Department of Education, and it went on, as I said, starting in 2012. 2020 and through the January 2022, and most of the others are dealt with from other agencies. And I'm going to get to this interagency, this enterprise view level of fraud later in my remarks. But as far as I can tell, this $250 million number was a number put out by the U.S. Attorney when the first set of indictments were handed out, and those were handed out in September of 2022, and the number has never been updated. Even though there have been dozens and dozens of additional indictments, they're up to 70 persons have been indicted in the case, but the number's never been updated. And as far as I can tell, it's really meant to cover feeding our futures share of the take. There are two other large nonprofits involved, and again, I'll talk about them a little later. And if you included them, none of them have been indicted. There's nobody associated with these other nonprofits who've been charged with any criminal wrongdoing, but they've both been shut down by the Department of Education, are no longer allowed to participate in the program. In one instance, some of the principals of the program have been banned from participating in food programs. And the third example, which I have included a lawsuit from the State Attorney General, he took the extraordinary move of filing a civil lawsuit against the nonprofit and succeeded in getting a court to order its dissolution, so it no longer exists in any corporate form. And from my research, though the big three plus a few other smaller nonprofits that were also shut down by the State Department of Education in the wake of the scandal puts the total above or about $500 million. So I've included the number here because it's the number put out by the U.S. Department of Justice, but again, by my research, I think the total number for the food fraud probably is double that, around 500 million. The CCAP program, I understood you got into this program with a prior hearing that you held of this committee, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Would point out, though, that and I know you also talked about this at a prior hearing. Jay Coles of Channel 5, KSTP, did a series of reports following up on, this is a report that the legislative auditor put out in 2019, but he did a follow-up report here, I believe it was last January, just a couple of weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, where he visited some of the top earning, if you will, child care facilities in the metro area and found no children and no adults the several times he visited during working hours. And again, there was some controversy about that. It was an accusation of he was mistaken in one of the addresses. So I saw a report where he went back to the address listed in public records, still no children, still no adults. So this is the number that was put out by a whistleblower back in 2019. I haven't updated it. I haven't tried to keep track of it, but you could tell the CCAP program and child care subsidies by the state continue to be a problem. The new way, again, the next two items, items 3 and 4, are addiction recovery services. And the one called New Way is the subject of a lawsuit. I believe New Way was the one who sued the Department of Education, and the accusation there is overbilling. And that's a number that I've put in there that has been thrown out, what they may have overbilled the state government for these addiction services. But again, that's the subject of litigation. And actually it's the one a couple of down, Evergreen Recovery, sorry, it was a couple of down. Evergreen Recovery is accused of taking, again, it's an overbilling case, $30 million out of the Medicaid program overseen by Department of Human Services. And that's the subject of litigation by the Department of Justice against Evergreen Recovery, and also there have been criminal charges levied in that case as well, where the Department of Justice has indicted a couple of executives with the firm. And again, CARE 11 has been the one behind the investigation of this addiction recovery company for the last couple of years. They did a report just last week on a new set of searches that were undertaken by the FBI of Evergreen, the homes of Evergreen executives, and there's a possibility there could be more criminal indictments in that case. And just wanted to bring that to your attention. Since I last updated this, I haven't found anything to add to increase the dollar amount, but there have been new developments in a number of these cases. So that's just my quick introduction of the fraud, waste, and abuse tracker. But I did want to mention early on that happy to make this interactive. We don't have to wait to the end if you have burning questions as I go along, because I'm going to cover a lot of ground. And if you have a question about New Way or Evergreen, and that was 10, 20 minutes ago, then if you got something now, I'd be happy to take them as we go. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Glenn. And the point that I really want you to address in specific examples of the study you've done in these different programs, but I think it's something the committee has deep concerns about, is the business model of fraud. And so in my research, in testimony before the committee and in meetings with whistleblowers, what seems to occur is that vulnerable people in our state are preyed upon by people who are greedy and want to make money off them. And so they sign people up for services that may or may not be received, and then they either overbill or bill for services not rendered, or add in additional services that may not be necessary. And then people who really are in need of services either don't get the services or are sort of kept in a loop so that they don't really get better and continue to get signed up for services when they don't recover. And that seems to be the business model that I am discovering as I work through all these different programs and as we have testimony on the record or off the record. And so I just wondered if you could speak to what you have seen as sort of like the pattern of fraud and how it develops, and if you've had a similar encounter of a sort of business model where people are preying on the vulnerable citizens in our state to either overcharge or charge for services not rendered. Mr.
Right.
Glenn.
Well, I could certainly give you some examples of people involved in the Feeding Our Future fraud where that was the case, but I'm going to direct you down a little farther on my tracker to item number 18. And it looks fairly innocuous. It's Medicaid fraud, $2.6 million, not the biggest fraud on the list by any means. This was a case brought by the state attorney general, Keith Ellison. Within his office, he has an office for, or it's a unit, the medical fraud investigative unit, and it is what it says. They investigate fraud against the Medicaid programs primarily run by the Department of Human Services. They investigate frauds, they bring charges, they prosecute cases. This was a case from a couple of years ago, and in fact, it was an investigation. I included a press release from the Attorney General in the packet. I don't know which one it is in the packet, but it's in there. But it was called Pit Stop 66. And it was primarily an investigation of fraud originating in the Faribault area, 45 minutes south of here. And what they found, and they named the investigation after this, PIT stands for Medicaid Provider, Interpreter, and Transportation. So these individuals who were indicted in this case were accused of conducting an entire portfolio of fraud. And so what they were doing is they had medical providers, people providing medical services, as you described, to the low-income, vulnerable members of the Faribault area community. They would literally drive them, and I forgot what the limit is that you can get reimbursed.
60 miles per.
So they would thank you, Madam Chair and Representative Rarick. They would drive them 59 miles to an appointment. So rather than find a provider in Faribault or Owatonna, they would provide them with an appointment up here in the Twin Cities area. They would drive them the 59 miles, bill for the 59 miles. Again, these are members of ethnic communities. They require interpreter services. They would hire an interpreter, and the interpreter, the driver, the medical provider would all work together to provide these services, but at the most expensive way you can imagine. So there was not just the distance, but say a van full of people, they'd be charged for individual rides. And you mentioned the business model, and again, some of the business model consisted of identity theft, where they would get the identifying information for people who were attending bona fide medical appointments. They'd get their name, their address, their social security number, and then they would bill for appointments that may have been scheduled, but the patient was never notified of. They never occurred. So there was overbilling, double billing, and this was their business model. They figured out the seams of each of these individual programs, the interpreter reimbursement program, the transportation program, reimbursement for medical appointments, and combine them into a single seamless fraud that they would go and bill the state for multiple times for a single appointment or multiple times for an appointment that never occurred. And you know, to the credit of the state government, Department of Human Services and the Attorney General's Medical Fraud Unit working together brought a prosecution against these folks. So there's, I think, an example of what you were describing, where that it wasn't just a matter of cutting corners here and there. That was their business plan. That was what they executed, and they did so for as long as they could before they got caught.
Thank you. Representative Rarick.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is fascinating. This is absolutely fascinating. Thank you for being here today and presenting that. I wanted to circle back with something just really, really quickly, because I haven't been able to find the video clip, but I remember watching live the very first press conference that Attorney General Lugar had. And I remember very clearly him saying, we know that there's been $500 million of fraud happening. Today, I can prove $250 million. And that is exactly what you had said, that through all your calculations and through all of your tracking of all of this, you arrived at the same number. And I know we'll be speaking with Andy Lugar soon so that he can come and tell us himself, but I cannot find that video clip. I have searched for hours looking for I looked on the website where he has his press conferences, but so my question, so let me go to another point. So thank you for that. So my second point is when we had CCAP, when we had the conversation here about CCAP, we asked them specifically about how much have you recovered, and they were very proud to say they had $2.4 million since 2020 recovered. During that same time, they had $1.1 billion of CCAP money go out, so they were very excited they had recovered $2.4 million in CCAP money back. But the problem is most of that was just curtailing future payments. They really hadn't recovered anything. As you've been going through all of this deep dive on this, you had also mentioned about 60 or 70 million maybe had been recovered with Feeding Our Futures. Have you, can you talk a little bit about anything that's been recovered?
Yeah, so Madam Chair?
Mr. Glenn.
Representative Rarick. So a couple of things in there, and some of them are interrelated. So the recoveries, and again, this is one of my eternal frustrations with the State Department of Education, is they don't believe they're in the recovery business, that they have outsourced all of that to the U.S. Attorney's Office. And it's the same with the Attorney General. To his credit, he has filed dozens of lawsuits against these nonprofits who have been implicated in the scam. And he's succeeded in shutting many of them down, dissolving their corporations. To my knowledge, he's recovered exactly $1,000 in recoveries. You know, these are civil cases, and his object is to, as you point out, stop the bleeding. And I want to make one point till I come back about recoveries. If I leave one message here behind this morning, is the key mission should be to stop the money going out the door to begin with. And so you look at the Feeding Our Future scandal, and whether you look at it from the inception of April 2040, when they had already identified the people who would be future fraudsters and denied their applications from the get-go, to where they were sued and were in state court and some rulings went against them. They had actually stopped payments to Feeding Our Future in March or so of 2021, and then end up having some setbacks in court and resume payments. And had they taken a different path, there was another $100 million that went out the door after they resumed payments to these organizations that they knew were committing fraud against the state. But as for the recoveries, on one hand, again, you're disappointed it's only 25% of the total, but on the other hand, you have to understand what the state is up against. Most of that money probably came from bank accounts that they seized as part of the searches that were conducted in January of 2022 1992. There was other things where there was an office building on Lake Street in Minneapolis where they seized it through forfeiture and they sold it. They found a buyer for it. They found a buyer for an office building on Lake Street and they sold it for a couple $1 million, and that was part of the recovery. Some vehicles, again, vehicles, everybody knows you buy a new car, you drive it off the lot, it's worth a significant percent less. So these are all used cars. They were all bought as new cars by the defendants. But same thing with the real estate. They've seized quite a bit of real estate. Again, it's in Minnesota, Kentucky, Ohio, Colorado. But the biggest problem are two things. One is money's just been spent. It was spent on Las Vegas junkets where one person involved in the case rented a Ferrari for the weekend, high-end hotels. It also involves the spending of just mundane things, mortgage monies, money at Home Depot, paying your credit card bills, and then millions and millions of dollars sent overseas. So money has been sent to Africa, to Asia, invested in cryptocurrency, and that money is never coming back. And and again, more than half, I said there were 70 people indicted, more than half, 37, have now pled guilty in the case, and 5 additional defendants were acquitted at trial. 2 were acquitted, but 42 is the number of convictions we have in the case. And every time there's a guilty plea or a courtroom conviction, one of the things in the order is forfeitures and restitution. And they're all on the hook for whatever the Department of Justice determined or a jury determined was their share of the take. But, it's blood from a turnip. How do you, after their assets have been seized, and how do you get this money if it's been sent abroad or is in cryptocurrency? And again, you look through some of these and the pattern is just as I mentioned the Evergreen Recovery and CARE 11's most recent report, this most recent actions by the FBI, they unsealed a search warrant, and it was the same thing except, slight variations on the theme. Instead of a Lamborghini in Las Vegas, it was private jets to the Hamptons and charging millions of dollars on the company credit cards. So if it's just for those disposable items, and again, every time they do one of these raids, they find envelopes full of cash and jewelry and stuff like that that has resale value or intrinsic value, but a lot of it, money was just got spent and it's not going to be recovered.
Thank you, Mr. Glenn. I'm going to turn to Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Chair. Just two things for now. One is it occurs to me since we were talking about the Assistant Attorneys General working on that Medicaid fraud scheme, just wondering, Madam Chair, if you consider, I think you and I talked about this separately, but having those folks come in specifically. So rather than hearing somebody talk about their work kind of secondhand, hearing from them directly, which is not to rip on this at all, but just sort of, I want to make sure to highlight that, Madam Chair, that we should consider having the Assistant Attorneys General in. And I think, is that something you're considering, Madam Chair?
Yes, we are considering it. Thank you.
Thank you. And then the other thing was just process-wise, Madam Chair, if you can provide guidance. Will Mr. Glan be sort of doing a presentation, and then we'll have time for member questions at the end? I know I've got quite a few. I think my colleagues do as well. Is that something where, kind of, if you can just give some guidance for sort of how we should be fitting? I'm very happy to do that and want to listen to him the full way through and then be able to ask a bunch of questions, but I want to know what your preference is.
Right. I think it's good if you have questions on a particular item he's discussing to raise it at that point, but we don't want to get too far in the weeds. We want him to finish the presentation. So, I'll rein it in if it seems like we're getting too far afield, but the idea is as he's discussing a particular case or example, if you have questions on that particular example, feel free to signal that.
And then maybe, Chair, then just as a follow-up to that then, so then assuming we're not asking all those questions along the way, there will be time at the end then to ask a bunch of questions.
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Glan. Thank you, Chair.
Vice Chair Anderson.
Thank you. I do have a specific question about the Faribault case. So I understand the transport and this part, but were the actual providers legitimate providers of these services, or were they even using the providers that they were driven to in the Twin Cities?
Mr. Glan.
The actual medical provider. Who was that? What was that?
Madam Chair, again, the details of that I don't have at my fingertips. I want to say the answer is both, but I don't want to speak out of turn.
And I would just refer members to your packet. There's a very detailed account of it in the Attorney General's press release that I think speaks to that, so.
Right, and Madam Chair, Representative Anders, I believe if you go to that, if you can Google that press release, there's a link in the press release to an actual indictment that was filed that has way more detail in it. So again, I don't have this at my beck and call, so I'm not going to go out on a limb and answer it definitively.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Glenn, please continue with your presentation.
Well, inspired by Representative Pinto, I think I will return to my actual presentation here. And I've been hung up on the Feeding Our Future because it's the biggest one, but I did want to mention a couple of other items which I've alluded to earlier this morning, but trying to get to that $500 million number that Representative Rarick was referring to. And I think if you look at the data, it's hard to come to a different conclusion. The legislative auditor put out a very, very detailed report on the Department of Education's handling of just the Feeding Our Future nonprofit, rich in detail, finding out who said what when, who knew what when, dollar amounts, heavily sourced, and large bibliography. They had a chart in there that showed the total program spending, and there's actually two programs. It's the Child and Adult Care Food Program and the Summer Food Service Program. They're both from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but their local agent in Minnesota is the Department of Education. It dovetails well with the school lunch stuff. So they're the agent for the USDA here in Minnesota, and they showed a chart of the total dollars that went out from those two programs in Minnesota to all recipients. And there are hundreds and hundreds of nonprofits, churches, YMCAs, schools that participate in one or both of these programs, heavily daycare related for obvious reasons, and total together, the total amount of dollars that went out. For the year 2021, which was the peak year of the fraud, the total amount of money that went out the door in 2021 to just Feeding Our Future was 42% of the total of the two programs. So short of half, 40%, 2/5 of all the dollars that went out in that 1 year went to one nonprofit out of the hundreds and hundreds of nonprofits. From memory, the number of different sites is over 1,000, ranges in the thousands. This one nonprofit, who's the middleman for hundreds of sites, took out over $200 million from the program, more than 40% of the total. If you add in the next two largest nonprofits, these middlemen who coordinate between distribution sites and the Department of Education, you get to more than 2/3, actually 70% of all the dollars that went through these two programs to feed low-income, hungry children were taken out by three nonprofits, one of whom is in court starting again on Wednesday on trial for multiple counts of fraud and money laundering and conspiracy. The second largest one was called Partners in Nutrition, and it did business as Partners in Quality Care. It was the second largest nonprofit. And the third largest one was called Youth Leadership Academy. And I mentioned I had put into the packet a lawsuit filed, again, by a different set of people at the Attorney General's office. They have the fraud unit, and they also have something called the Charities Division, which oversees nonprofits in the state. And I'll get back to that as well. But they sued in state court, a civil lawsuit to dissolve the third largest, this Youth Leadership Academy. Youth Leadership Academy actually had been shut down the month before the FBI raids by the Department of Education. They took the extraordinary step of banning the officers of that company from participating in these food cases. The Youth Leadership Academy sued them in state court, maybe in federal court too, lost those cases. And again, the Attorney General sued them and had the corporate entity dissolved. And the Partners in Nutrition and Youth Leadership Academy, their names have come up over and over again in the two trials that have been conducted in the fraud case. One was conducted last spring, started in April, ended in June, of 7 defendants, 5 of whom were convicted to acquitted. And the current case that began in early February, their names have come up over and over again. but nobody associated with either of these entities has been charged with any criminal wrongdoing. And I don't know if anybody suggested that criminal activity took place. But again, if you look at the Attorney General's lawsuit, you look at the evidence that has come out in the Feeding Our Future trials, it's clear that these two entities were not operating within the parameters of the program rules and have both been banned from participation. So how do you categorize that? It's not fraud. Is it waste? Is it abuse? Not having a dollar associated with these two individuals, I think they're part of that 500 million that I cited from my work and perhaps the U.S. Attorney's work as well, but not part of the 250 million that the U.S. Attorney has assigned to Feeding Our Future.
Mr. Glahn, if I could interrupt for one moment, just to provide some context for the members. I did some work on this over the weekend. In the group you're referring to, Partners in Nutrition, they total had $214 million between the years of 2017 and 2022, before they were shut down. $214 million for this group. The other group, Youth Leadership Academy, also known as Gargar Family Services, interestingly, they started in FY '21 with just $21,000. In FY '22, that went from $21,000 to $26 million. And so their total was just under $27 million in those 2 years. And they were the subject of the Attorney General lawsuit that honestly just was resolved here in December of 2024. And the resolution of that settlement was that they were required to dissolve, but all of their assets, interestingly, rather than going back to the state, are going to be allowed to go to a new nonprofit. So I think this is an ongoing concern, members, and something we'll, of course, ask the Attorney General about when his staff comes. But clearly, they've done great work in the Attorney General's office in identifying this. But those two totals, $214 million from the Partners in Nutrition and another $27 million from the Youth Leadership Academy, were not counted in that original $250 million. So just provide some context of the scale here. Thank you, Mr. Glenn. Representative Rarick.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just really quickly to that point, in the same document we have in front of us, again, having worked many years in nonprofit, it was astounding to me that the group, Youth Leadership Academy, also known as Gargar Family Services, had 2 board members. So if anyone had even looked a little bit behind the curtain, Madam Chair, just a peek behind the curtain, they would have said, something is up here. They're not registered. So they failed to register with the Attorney General, 1 red flag. They had 2 board members, 2 red flags. Their revenue just skyrocketed so quickly. Like you said, they landed at $27 million. So it's not that hard. The oversight isn't that hard. We should have, to Mr. Glon's point, the state failed to do even the bare minimum of looking behind the curtain, Madam Chair. And this is a prime example of it. Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you. Mr. Glahn, please continue your presentation.
Madam Chair, so to your point that you had just made, I'll quote the outgoing U.S. Attorney, the former U.S. Attorney, Andy Lugar. The $250 million number is a floor, not a ceiling. And also quote him in an exit interview he did right before he left office in January. Minnesota has a fraud problem. And I put up, just happened to have his photo from that press conference that we've referenced a couple of times. Dina Winter, who's now with the Star Tribune, but at the time she wrote for Minnesota Reformer, and she did an interesting deep dive into a lot of the people who had at that time been indicted in the case, and found that nearly half of the people who had been indicted in the food fraud had other businesses taking money out of state government. And you mentioned the kind of business model, and the business model seems to be this portfolio, again, of all the programs. And so just so I don't forget them here, I'm going to read them out loud. So including but not limited to childcare, adult daycare, autism clinics, personal care assistance programs. If there was a state program that provided money to nonprofits or even for-profits, they had a hand in it. And we mentioned the interpreter services, the transportation services, and we have heard, well, in fact, one of my items, there is some indictments in the autism clinic case. And there are connections between many of the people who are indicted in Feeding Our Future. They own childcare businesses, they owned adult daycare businesses. In some instances, they were accused of stealing maybe hundreds of thousands or a couple of $1 million from the state through the food programs, and they had other businesses, perhaps legitimate, perhaps not, taking millions, if not tens of millions of dollars. And I wanted to call your attention to another item on the tracker, which was the subject, and I have the story here. I'm not very good with this. No. Well, it was an NPR article, and it was done about a Feeding Our Future defendant who had been, she's one of the few people who appear on my tracker more than once. She was indicted as part of a federal case in 2021 where she was involved in a group defrauding the state through interpreter services. She worked for an interpreting company, and she was indicted in that case. And again, from memory, it was $50,000, $100,000 she was accused of taking from that. She took millions out of the food program as part of the Feeding Our Future scam, and she was indicted in that. She has pled guilty in both cases. So I want to call to your attention the fact that she had been indicted in federal court by the U.S. Attorney's Office for one scam, while the other scam continued, and she continued to receive money from the Department of Education. So what we have here, I'm quoting everybody, failure to communicate from the old movie with, anyway, so we have this NPR news article in your packets that talks about Defending Our Future, defendant number 33, and how she was double dipping from the program. So it just seems that agencies aren't talking to one another. They're not sharing information with one another. And again, I've been following this for years. There were a couple of hearings that were held by the state Senate a couple of years ago when this was still a fairly fresh scandal. And what they had done is brought in the leadership, the then leadership, they're not there anymore, the then leadership of the State Department of Education to answer questions about their oversight of Feeding Our Future. And they told their story, and I've seen where either this committee or other committees here at the House or the Senate have brought in leadership from DEED, leadership from the Department of Education, Department of Human Services, where the message has been, well, just because somebody's been accused of or indicted from stealing from one agency, that doesn't mean we could stop the money going out from our agency. And the excuse is either due process or limitations in state law. And hopefully we can get that resolved, where it's more important to get the money from not going out the door than it is trying to recover it years later, trying to bring cases in court that can take years to prosecute and get to a verdict on. It would be much easier and much better for everyone involved to not let the money go out the door. So there needs to be some sort of enterprise-wide level where we do something, and I know we'll get to this in the what are the solutions portion of the hearing, but I just wanted to emphasize there isn't anybody at that level today. You know, we've talked about the legislative auditor who does great work. We've talked about the attorney general who does work in both overseeing nonprofits through the charities division and investigating Medicaid fraud through that unit. We have the U.S. Attorney's Office who's done great work in prosecuting the Feeding Our Future. They have their silos though. And what we've seen is fraudsters who work every program there is, multiple programs, and seeing various levels of success. Again, our recurring theme is people defrauding one program and taking money from another. I know you had the OLA come in and talk about her report from a couple of years ago about grants oversight, and from her report, and if again from memory, there was something like 27 different state agencies give out grants. And so when you have a situation where somebody has been defrauding or abusing one program, the other 26 need to hear about that. There needs to be a universal list of the do not defraud list of people we shouldn't be giving money to if it's been well established that they've been abusing or ripping off one of the other programs. So we need to do that. And I've talked about my list and how it was put together. There's nobody really in state government or at the federal level who's in a position to or has an incentive to try to come up with a global list. All I've done is scour public services to try to come up with ones I believe should belong on here. Question I get a lot is why isn't X on the list? Why isn't MNLARS on the list? Why isn't MNSURE on the list? Lots of other stuff. Southwest Light Rail would certainly qualify as abuse or waste. No hint of criminal activity, civil lawsuits. It's epidemic in the state. Minnesota has a fraud problem, and I hope you do get to talk to Andy Luger because he did that great interview. He talked about how this was the largest, and speaking of feeding the future, this was the largest single COVID-related fraud anywhere in America. And he said it didn't happen other places. I've been contacted by people in other states. I did a television interview in Alabama where they had almost identical this fraud, but it was $6 million. It wasn't $500 million. So it happened, but it didn't happen at this scale anywhere else in America. So again, we have this going across state government. We have these great institutions that are doing great work in Minnesota. I'm sure there are cases to be made for giving more resources to the Attorney General's offices in these two areas, to giving more money to the Office of Legislative Auditor. There are proposals floating out there to create an Inspector General for the entire executive branch to consolidate this in one place in state government. I know my colleague who's sitting off to the wings here, Bill Walsh, and I both are enamored of an idea where we would give more power to the elected state auditor to go after fraud at the state level rather than at the local level. And so I'm happy to talk about the pros and cons of all of that, but I know there are many member questions, so I've got more to say, but I'll say it in response to queries.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Mr. Glenn. I know that you had said you'd have a section on solutions, so is that your discussion about empowering the elected state auditor, or did you have more to say on that before we go to questions?
With your invitation, Madam Chair. So I talked about those entities. You need somebody who has an enterprise-wide perspective, who isn't in a silo of a specific agency or a specific program, or, again, I would argue even the specific branch of government. So the legislative auditor does great work. But the proposals, I know many bills have been heard and advanced with the idea of creating this Inspector General for the entire executive branch, and which does solve the enterprise-wide problem, that they would presumably be empowered to go after any state agency to ensure compliance, to prevent fraud, but make sure that, and you heard this from grants management, everybody's on the same page, following the same rule book. My concern about that is personnel as policy. And what we saw in the CCAP program, and again, I don't want to use the word relitigate that fiasco, but you had somebody serving in the Inspector General position in the Department of Human Services who, again, in my opinion, didn't seem all that inspired or interested in investigation or inspecting. And so nothing really happened with that. And there were some indictments, some convictions in court. The legislative auditor did an excellent report, which I've quoted from here this morning. But that thing, according to the J. Cole's media reports, still continues, and it doesn't seem like it's ever been fundamentally addressed. And so if you have somebody in a position of Inspector General, somebody you're counting on to go after fraud, ensure compliance with rules, regulations, laws, that make sure that standards are being met, and they're not interested or they have other agendas, in the end, you've just created another position in the state bureaucracy. So I'm a little concerned about that as the silver bullet approach. Maybe we need more of a all the above approach where you do put more staffing, more resources to the auditor. Again, why I like the idea of empowering the state auditor, this elected position already exists and it's elected. So you have the concern of, to whom is this person responsible? So the Inspector General, again, my opinion of the DHS, wasn't responsible or answerable to anyone. So when that person didn't do the work or didn't like the approach that was being suggested, then nothing happened. So the Inspector General for the state executive branch, presumably they report to the governor. I don't know if it was, I don't have that in front of me. Was there a Senate confirmation aspect of it too? That would be helpful. But depending on who gets put in that position will make or break the position. If it's a great person who's really going to go after fraud and look at making sure money doesn't go out the door, more concerned than, say, future prosecutions, it could be super helpful in saving resources for the state. And they're going to be up for re-election or election next year. So they can spend the next 18 months or so going to the voters, making their case on why that person would be a better state auditor to go after state fraud. And they would be answerable every 4 years to the electorate. If the electorate, the voters, the citizens of the state didn't think they were doing a great job, then they'd pick somebody new to do the job. But when you have somebody who's appointed or appointed by an appointee, then it's 2 steps removed from any level of accountability. So I have that, and because I have the floor, Madam Chair, I'll just go ahead and go through my red flags because Representative Rarick brought them up. We had over and over again the instance where somebody had been incorporated literally yesterday and was suddenly billing for thousands of meals per day. They didn't have food service licenses. They didn't have any of those niceties, didn't have a board of directors, but they were incorporated with the Secretary of State's office, hadn't yet applied or received a tax-exempt status from the IRS, but they were already billing the state government for services rendered. And again, that's another one, tax-exempt status. In many cases, a nonprofit loses their tax-exempt status with the IRS because they haven't filed tax returns. Probably the easiest path to have your status revoked. And I forgot, is it 3 years if you don't file a return that your status is revoked pretty much automatically? The IRS Form 990, if you read a few of them, they're not that complicated. It won't take you that long to fill out. So I would recommend that before state government gives out grants to nonprofits, that they require that this nonprofit will have existed long enough to have filed and made public a full year's worth of tax returns. That 12 months, you don't have to file calendar year, you can file fiscal year. So a 12-month tax return had been filed with the IRS that does stuff like list the board of directors and the compensation of officers and executives and basic information about who this organization is and what it does. And it would seem to me that that level of due diligence would be an automatic before state money would go out the door. But we had these examples of people with no tax-exempt status or revoked status, people who had just incorporated, had never filed a tax return, who, again, we talked about registration with the Attorney General's office and their charities division. And that was a red flag as well, where people had been around but hadn't taken that step, and so they weren't on the radar of the Attorney General's office, who could have looked into this. But the Attorney General's office deals with charities. The purpose, as I understand it, of that office is to regulate as a consumer protection effort to make sure that donors, people, mom and pop, and regular folks like everybody in the room here writing checks to the Red Cross or Salvation Army, that everything is on the up and up, and that they know their donations, their charitable contributions are going to the cause for which the organization exists. An organization that is nothing but a conduit for government money seems to be a qualitatively different thing. And I know we have these terms and they're all used interchangeably, nonprofits, NGOs, non-governmental organizations. But one of the ideas I've had for a while is to have a two-tiered isn't quite the idea, but perhaps a bifurcated system where you have people register as a charity whose intent is to raise money from private donors to do what we think of as charitable work, to help sick people, to distribute food and a lot of these other things. But those same things have become government operations as well, government responsibilities, where they have, in a lot of instances, delegated it to nonprofits to conduct. And if you look at Feeding Our Future or any of these other names that we've mentioned, they were 100% government funded. All they did was take money from state government, sometimes it's county governments. Some of these nonprofits, I remember digging into them and they were getting money from at least half a dozen different agencies. They would take money from the Department of Human Services, the Department of Health, the Department of Employment and Economic Development. They were running job training programs. They were taking money from the Department of Education for the food programs. They were taking money from the legacy program for cultural and arts programming. And then they were also taking money from county governments and city governments. Again, I don't know how you can deal with that at this level, but again, a whole portfolio. But the one thing was not $1 from a private donor. They had a lot of contracts with government agencies, and it seems to me that that's a qualitatively different kind of organization, one for which I don't think the Charities Division of the Attorney General's office was really designed to oversee. Perhaps that needs oversight through Department of Administration, Management Budget, Department of Revenue, something like that, where they have looked into these folks who don't take money from small dollar donors, private donors, who are only taking money through government contracts and regulate them in a different way. And again, I'm getting a little off topic myself here. I discovered the existence of something here in Minnesota, and it's in other states as well. I call it the nonprofit for-profit. And technically, it's called a public benefits corporation, and we have something called the Minnesota Public Benefits Corporation Act. I'm perhaps not saying it exactly right, but it's a for-profit company. It's incorporated the same as you would an S Corp or a C Corp or an LLC, something like that. But it wants to operate and get the benefit of the doubt of being a nonprofit. And so they're not in the tawdry business of trying to make a buck, but to serving the public. But the problem I have with it is it doesn't have the level of transparency that an actual nonprofit has. If you're a nonprofit, you have to file that Form 990. If you're a nonprofit, you're supposed to register with the Attorney General's office, and they have a very handy search tool where you can search a nonprofit and you get a ton of financial information for each one. But if you're a private company who's incorporated as this chimera hybrid public benefit corporation, you are legally a for-profit company. You do not have tax exempt status. You do not have to make your tax returns public. You do not have to have this registration with the Attorney General's office, I don't think. So the amount of information, the transparency of the operations of nonprofits, again, the Foodless Food Charity, I did an investigation. One of these companies incorporated as a food charity and somehow didn't spend $1 on food. I figured this out by reading their Form 990s. The FBI agents and the auditors who testified in federal court in the last week did the same thing. They went through 990s. They had access to all the bank account records and they had a lot more data than I had, but they could figure this out through fairly easy looking at basic numbers that this thing was not on the up and up.
So, Mr. Glenn, if I can jump in.
Sure.
Did any of the groups that were part of Feeding Our Future or the other groups listed on the tracker here, are any of those these public benefit corporations to your knowledge, or are they all nonprofit?
They're all excuse me, Madam Chair. To my knowledge, all of them are nonprofit. The public benefits thing came up in a different context, and it was with the Department of Employment and Economic Development. Okay. So I don't know if we want to get into that. That's very deep in the weeds. Just a couple of other recommendations, since you asked for recommendations. And again, I'm going to be super careful saying this. I have a huge, I don't know if I know all of you personally, but I have a huge amount of respect for each of you personally as individuals and as state representatives. But I would have, if not in statute, a House rule, and I would hope the Senate would adopt a similar rule, that if you are an elected representative currently serving, you are not allowed to serve on a board of any nonprofit or public benefit corporation receiving state funding. Seems like a pretty basic
I heartily
conflict
agree
of
with
interest provision. And again, I'll go back to my days, along with Mr. Walsh, of being at the Department of Commerce, where we had working under us, again, government outsourcing government functions to the private sector. We had a number of these community action agencies working for the Department of Commerce's Energy Division. They were handing out the LIHEAP grants. and for the most part doing good work, but there was one located in Minneapolis who the CEO and his son ended up going to federal prison because of their mismanagement of that. And a weird creature of, I believe, 1960s Great Society, these community action agencies by law have to have elected officials on them in their board. So they did, and again, it creates an obvious public conflict of interest. And again, no legislative earmarks. You know, we've had this, we can get into that if people want to, about how there are written into session law appropriations directed at a single nonprofit, and which bypasses all that grants management stuff, all that agency oversight stuff we had discussed earlier. And then my statewide ban list. If you've cheated one program, then you don't get money from any other program. But the legislative earmarks, again, we had processes at the Department of Commerce when I was there. We have processes at all 27 grant-making agencies that go through and do some of this due diligence we've talked about before. Part of the problem with Feeding Our Future was all that got delegated to the Feeding Our Future through a contract they had with the Department of Education. And so driving around, looking at these sites would have raised red flags and shut down a lot of these locations years earlier than they were shut down. But again, I would recommend, and this is something I think the feds had adopted at one time, where Congress did not allow earmarks from members, and I would recommend the same thing. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Glenn. Representative Rarick.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There's so much there, Mr. Glan. So as we've been kind of mulling through some of these items and these thoughts and these kind of proof for nonprofits for weeks now, something that we've been talking about is the salaries of the highest paid people in the nonprofits. And as I've been reviewing nonprofits, some of them are reasonable, and I've actually been doing this work in the higher ed committee, so I've sort of inherited this budget as the higher ed chair. But every single entity that is organized as a nonprofit has come before our committee. And so I've looked at their 990s, their audited financial reports, to make sure they have an IRS determination letter, make sure that they have a current status, make sure they're registered with the Secretary of State and the Attorney General. But one thing I've added to this list is the salaries of their highest paid people, which of course you can see in the 990. And many of them are way above the governor. And the reason that's important is because, as you know, the Subcommittee on Employee Relations exists in the legislature so that if any local government wants to pay anybody more than the governor, they had to come to the legislature and get permission to do that. And it had to be an action that we took in the SCR. Now, last biennium, that was done away with, unfortunately. The SCR's authority was gutted. But nonetheless, that had been standing policy for decades. So that's one thing that I'd like to add to your list, is that we actually, somebody review the salaries of the highest paid people within these nonprofits. Many of them make what the governor makes, if not 2, 3, 4, 5 times more. Another thing that you had kind of gotten to is the charitable work versus kind of government work. So charity, as we think of, like they're, doing grants to grants to foundations, or doing fundraisers, they're getting money from individuals, as opposed to kind of existing only to get government money and government grants and then doing the service. So kind of like a government NGO, a non-government organization doing government work. And so another thing that we've been talking about, I just want to get your feedback on those two things. So the other thing is making sure that we're looking at how much government money they're currently getting as they're coming from more grants from the state. And some of them that I've looked at in my committee, maybe about a quarter are government grants. Some of them are 70, well, I can think of one right at the top of my head that's over 70% government money coming through. So those are two quick things that I wrote down everything that you said, and I do like them, but I just wanted to get your thoughts about looking at the salaries of the highest paid people, and then looking at the percentage of government money. And I guess I would add one other thing, because the legislative auditor said it and the Office of Grant Management said it, which is the capacity to use the grant. So if you've got, say, a nonprofit that in their previous year had a revenue of 1.5 million, and yet they're coming to the state for 10 million, maybe there's an issue there. I raised that in the Energy Committee last biennium, but in any case, the capacity to use the grant. I would love feedback on those two things, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative Rarick. Mr. McGlone.
Madam Chair, Representative Rarick. Yes, definitely the red flag of salaries at the nonprofit level. I mentioned the Community Action in Minneapolis. That was a red flag, that you looked at what the CEO of that nonprofit was getting compared to his peer nonprofits. It was disproportionate. So there was definitely a red flag there. And that person ended up serving some time in federal prison because of defrauding that nonprofit, who almost exclusively worked with state programs. They did not just the energy program, but a bunch of other different programs, Head Start, that sort of thing. I've also seen exactly the opposite. I mentioned nonprofits who didn't exist yesterday, and today they're billing for serving thousands of meals. Many of them never filed a tax return. So they came and went. They were birthed into existence, and they died an unnatural death, and they never got around to notifying the IRS in between. So there was nothing. That was one of my recommendations, that they be around long enough. You have a 990 to look at. A lot of these came and went before they could even file a 990, and they never will. So there's that. And I saw other examples where people did file 990s, but you can tell it was somebody did it. I don't look like they took them 10 minutes to do it. They had a revenue number. They had a expenses number. None of the expenses were itemized. They might have gone for salaries. They might have gone for food. We don't know. There was only 3 numbers in the entire tax return: revenue, expenses, and the net. So not all of them are as diligent as they are supposed to be under IRS regulations, or as they should be for your purposes in trying to vet them. So some of them would list no salaries. That line would be left blank because presumably all of it was lumped into this other category or that. So I did want to make a related point, I think, about salaries at the NGO level. Some of them are, again, done in a way that they can skirt the pay limits. As a deputy commissioner, I was limited to the dollar amount I could be paid in state government. And many nonprofit executives make many times that, sometimes 7 figures. And, maybe the organization is large enough to justify that. But it's certainly something worth a question or two in a committee hearing about. But also on the other end, something that we've seen where by outsourcing government functions to non-governmental organizations, you not only escape the law about how much you can pay executives, but you also take advantage of their ability, the NGO's ability, the nonprofit's ability to hire at the bottom end of the scale. So somebody doing the same work somebody would do in state government or county government or city government delivering these services, they're able to get somebody on their payroll and pay them lower than I forgot what we call it at the state level, GS scale from my days in the feds. Or they're using volunteer work. They're not paying people. So people who would be paid if they were working for county government to deliver social services, they're counting on volunteers to do that. That leaves more profit on the bottom line for a nonprofit. So when you outsource government functions to non-government organizations, there's a whole list, a whole portfolio, a whole pantheon of laws that you get to skirt. And then quickly refresh me on what your other point was. I got kind of wrapped up in the...
Representative Rarick, last point, and then we'll go to Chair Pinto.
I think you hit it. I was just talking about the grant capacity. So I talked about what percentage they're getting from government overall. If it's more than, say, 50%, it's kind of like when you do a bonding and you have to have a match. The salaries, which you spoke to, and then their even capacity to even use the grant. That was the 3.
Right, and Madam Chair, if to that
Glenn.
point, I wrote a piece on our website last week. We think this is horrific stuff at the state level, $250 million, $500 million out the door. The EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, is looking at $20 billion who are sent out the door. Again, same story. This is a Delaware company founded just a few months ago, didn't have any employees. They got a $2 billion grant with a B and basically no string. So Again, when I was an analyst here at the House, I would look for those earmarks. The thing that I always caught my eye for capacity buildings, or for capacity building purposes, because that's just, you can use it for whatever you want. And again, we need to tighten up that you're giving money and you know you're getting the results that you are seeking from that grant.
Thank you. Chair Pinto.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, Mr. Galan. And yeah, I might ask, now that you finish your presentation, I think a bunch of us have a number of questions. We want to make sure to benefit from your information, so we'll want to make sure to get to the questions. So if you're able to keep your answers fairly focused, that'd be most appreciated. So my first question is just about your background, because you're here sharing your expertise with us, and just wondering about the source of that expertise. My understanding is that you're a researcher, and that as part of that, you review reports and news articles and court filings, sort of what I might call secondary research. You don't yourself have a background in academia or in forensic investigation or law enforcement or prosecution. I think you've been have an MBA, same school as I do, by the way. Go Cavaliers. And then as well worked in energy policy in the Plant Administration, worked in the House Republican Caucus, worked at CAE. But just could you just sort of the source of your expertise that you're sharing with us?
Mr. Glan.
Madam Chair, Representative Pinto, Chair Pinto, I'm glad you brought up our shared experience at the Darden School, because remarkably enough, a lot of what I've put to work is that stuff that you and I learned in first year, accounting. I took a corporate finance track. I don't know what your expertise was, but I took a corporate finance track in my second year. And to Representative Rarick's point, you don't need to have a CPA. I do not have a CPA, but you don't need a CPA if you know how to read a balance sheet, if you know how to read an income statement, a cash flow statement, if you've looked through prospecti, then you would see the red flags with a lot of these organizations. And again, that's why I'm frustrated with the Public Benefits Corporation, that I don't think I'm going to be able to look at their tax returns. And as a guy who, I spent a little over a year as a corporate controller in my corporate life, filing those tax returns. Was it the Sarbanes-Oxley Act? I had to sign in blood on some document that all the numbers on our financial records were true and correct. So relying on that experience in particular, but I mentioned once or twice being a deputy commissioner at Commerce, we had grants that we were giving out to nonprofits, and then I was on the hook for whatever went wrong with that, and testifying on behalf of the Department of Commerce on our budget bills and all the money we sent out the door, being on the other side of a legislative auditor report. As much as I praise the work of the legislative auditor, it's not always comfortable being on the other end of the receiving end of their hard work. And then having been a staffer here for many years and helping committees review bills, construct bills, pass bills, and I did a lot of the vetting for our committees, whether it was Ways and Means or Chair Garofalo's Jobs Committee, of nonprofits who did get earmarks in those, trying to make sure that we weren't putting money out the door to organizations we were going to regret later on.
Thank you. Chair Pinto.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Glan. And actually, that's helpful to lead to my next question. And I wish I didn't have to confirm this, but I know you've got that political background you described. You've also described this research background. I'm assuming that you'd say that you're here as a researcher providing accurate information and complete information for us to make the best decisions. Are you putting you're not putting your finger on the scale one way or another or guiding things? There's not a political agenda. There's a trying to inform us with the best information agenda, or perhaps I want to give you the opportunity to assure us kind of how we should be thinking about you.
Mr. Glan.
Madam Chair, Representative Pinto, I'm not sure how to answer that, how you should be thinking about me. I really endeavor in my work for the center as a policy fellow to be as accurate as I can. Anybody who's read my work, I think, can get the gist of my political leanings, of my ideological leanings, which I think I explained in fair detail to you this morning. Again, when I write stuff for the website, I try to have everything, which is why I don't think I mentioned it, but I included as page 3 of the fraud tracker, citations, a bibliography page for each and every item that I put down there. So you, Representative Pinto, or your research staff can go and verify this. And if I've made a mistake and I'm not infallible, call it to my attention. I'll be happy to correct the record, to correct the tracker, which we keep this posted on our website. And if there's a number, I typo wrong or a wrong link to the source document, then be happy to fix that. I see my view, or my role here today as being the view of one of our policy fellows. I'm trying to recommend to you what I think is good public policy as it relates to grant making and the regulation of nonprofits and some for-profits in the state of Minnesota, so that taxpayer money can be preserved for the things that we all agree we should spend taxpayer money on. And when a dollar is stolen in fraud, that dollar is not available to feed a hungry child or to house the homeless or to build a road or any of the other things that we do with state government. And so, again, more than normal, I've tried to keep the sarcasm out of my speech here, because I think this is an ultra-serious topic that deserves, and I believe you're giving it the spirit it deserves in terms of what are the solutions? How do you keep money from going out the door so in the future, the equivalent of the $611 million won't go out the door and not be available for you to appropriate for other purposes?
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Glan. Chair Pinto, I'll just interrupt for one
Yeah,
moment.
please.
Yeah, I appreciate your solution suggestions, because the solutions that you suggested to us are things that other people who've testified before the committee from different quarters have also suggested in terms of enterprise-wide flagging of grants that are a problem in one area, and so other agencies know about it, limiting the salaries or making sure they've had 990s for a certain length of time, the Inspector General. So I do think we're hearing from a broad array of people who care about this issue in our state, Chair Pinto, and that it's interesting to me how much we're sort of circling around some of the same solutions regardless of who the presenter is. So Chair Pinto, back to you.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate it. Can you remind me, though, I don't remember those topics having come up in prior presentations, but maybe like the limiting of salaries and things like that. But can you remind me when that was?
No, the limiting of salaries, I don't recall, but certainly the OLA talked at length about the need for enterprise-wide grants management system and flagging when one agency has had a problem so that other agencies are aware of it.
Yeah.
And we've had other people talk about the need to be able to shut off payment earlier, to require 990s. So I think maybe not every suggestion matches exactly, but I think we are finding from the different testifiers who've presented, and more to come, that we're getting quite a laundry list of things we can do to strengthen grants and service providing in the state of Minnesota. But your floor, Chair Pinto.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, and I intended these first couple questions to be really short, actually, and it's gotten slightly more complicated. And what I heard Mr. Glan say ultimately is that accuracy is really important, which is really good. I was surprised, actually. I kind of maybe heard a little bit of that there may be a certain political goal or, pushing certain solutions. I'll maybe just set that aside because I'm going to hang on to the idea that I'm guessing, Madam Chair, that is the most important thing to you, is that we receive accurate information from folks who are in front of us as experts. And so I guess that's because it feels like a slight tension there. But in any case, I'll move on from that. So I'm going to turn my attention to the tracker then. And I'll just note that these are across a wide variety of dates, and you've got the dates obviously here. One thing that jumped out at me was that, we've made many reforms through the years. I'm thinking especially in 2019, 23, 24. Some of these, predate those reforms. The Dina Winter article that Mr. Glan referenced actually contains a great quote from a Republican senator talking about progress since 2019 and saying that DHS, quote, has made a great effort to combat fraud and says they have a very robust anti-fraud department. So that's good. I mean, just to say that recognizing some of these may have predated reforms that may have addressed some of the things that led to them. If I go to each of the lines, so I start the first line with Feeding Our Future, I think important to acknowledge the good work of our State Department of Education and identifying concerns and moving to stop payments, obviously blocked by a court, but that was an important thing for them. That's line one. But I want to dive into line two. So what is the source of the $100 million figure? I see a footnote, which says it's a legislative audit report from 2019, page 7. So I'm going to that auditor report. If you can just talk about the source. I mean, it's what page 7 says is that there was an investigator who alleged $100 million a year, or pardon me, not a year, but $100 million in the program. Is it that investigator that's the source of the $100 million figure in your chart?
Mr. Glan.
the source of my figure is the source I cite in the bibliography page.
Okay. Thank,
Chair Pinto.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Well, that's excellent. So yeah, so that page then, to confirm, it was an investigator in the program. So good to look at that page. The report has a lot of other pages, and the rest of the report from the same date, I note that the source date says March 13th, 2019. The rest of the report says that that same investigator that you relied upon, Mr. Glahn, is an investigator who made other allegations. Another allegation was unsubstantiated, the legislative auditor found. A third allegation was found to be misleading. This is in the very same report. And then finally, and actually there were other investigators who I think provided similar information. They were found by prosecutors to want to charge people before there was enough evidence, to come with conclusory statements, just to say one prosecutor said everyone knows is not evidence. And so bottom line is that our legislative auditor in the very same report, just 2 pages prior to page 7, says there was not evidence to substantiate the allegation of $100 million. So given all that, I'm just struggling. So why is that figure? Is it that you didn't know about the other pages in the report, or you knew about them and you included it in? Like, why is it in your tracker?
Mr. Glahn.
Madam Chair, Representative Pinto, yeah, so I spent, I don't know, a good 20 minutes trying to explain how 250 million probably was more, 500 million, but I went with the number 250 million because that was a source I could cite that other people could look up. And the same is true with the other 26. Now you're looking at number 2, so I picked the $100 million number. I actually spent quite a bit of time thinking about this one because I found a number of cases that were prosecuted and resulted in state courts where people are convicted and given prison time for frauds. And, you know, again, trying to add the number together over all of those cases. And then we had the J. Coles report, who included, from recollection, I don't have that report in front of me, tens of millions of dollars from organizations where he can't find children or employees at. And again, that's 5, 6, 7 years removed from the incidents described in the CCAP report. You had media reports, sensational media reports, and I forgot what the number, hundreds of millions of dollars in cash leaving from the Minneapolis airport to go to overseas. So it's a number that's been out in the public domain for a very long time, and perhaps we can quibble, would a different number be appropriate? Perhaps a larger number would be appropriate. We talked about how more than $1 billion has gone to recipients from this program, and there have been, I think, fairly serious questions raised about individual providers who get 8 figures out of the program. So as a placeholder, what do you put here when you're trying to come to a bottom line? So that's the number I've chosen. Representative Pinto.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chair Pinto, one more, and then we'll go to Representative Greenman.
Yeah, thank you. I'll ask a question, and I'll just have a comment. Why, if your goal is accuracy, and I found your answer earlier interesting, because I really thought you were going to say, listen, for this purpose, my goal is to inform policymakers, the public, with full information. And I found it interesting you talked about kind of pushing towards solutions. But I'm going to assume that your goal is accuracy. If it is, why do you even need a number? Like, isn't your goal to inform people of the truth? I heard earlier, I didn't hear anything where you provided any kind of nuance on that. So I guess I'm trying to understand, like, unless your goal is to achieve a political point, why do you even need to sort of add up numbers in that way versus to inform the public and policymakers with the most accurate information possible when $100 million is not accurate, according to the OLA?
So, Madam Chair.
Mr. Glahn.
Representative Pinto, I know you want to move on from this topic, but other than feeding our future, the Child Care Assistance Program is the #1 program I get asked about. And so I went and talked in some detail about how I didn't include MNsure, I didn't include MNLARS, I didn't include the Southwest Light Rail. I didn't include a lot of things that people ask me about, but for me to have something that I try to put forward as working towards comprehensive list of fraud, waste, and abuse in Minnesota social benefit programs and not have a number for the child care. I don't think it would be as accepted as it is today if I had just left that blank, as I left blank the autism thing for a long time because I didn't have a number to put toward it.
And final comment, Chair. Yeah, thank you. And I'm going to continue listening. I'll request just a minute at the end for final comments as minority lead. I will just say, Mr. Glan, that's the difference between an unbiased researcher that we can rely on, right, and a political partisan that we can't, is that what you do is you put accuracy and completeness and honesty as the very top goal, even if it's sort of not as convenient for a story you may be trying to tell. That is the difference between those two roles.
Chair Pinto,
Madam Chair, I have to respond to that.
first,
My
I would like to-
integrity and my
Mr.
ethics have been
Glan,
called into
Mr.
question
Glan.
by the lead.
Mr. Glan, I'm speaking, and I would like to respond. Chair Pinto, for the last 6 years, I have sat through hundreds of committee hearings where the majority, at the time from your party, brought in testifiers from a very obvious political perspective, and we never impugned the motives of those testifiers. We understood their perspective, and we took their data and asked respectful questions. And I find this appalling, and I'm apologizing on behalf of the committee, Mr. Glan. And I agree that we have testifiers from different perspectives in every single committee in this body, and we are all well aware of that. So I would just like to get the committee back on track. I feel like our committee has done a great job of trying to be bipartisan, trying to drive to solutions that we can all support for the good of the institution. And that is the mission of this committee, and we are going to focus on that. Representative Greenman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate that, and I actually was, as you were saying that, thinking about floor speeches going after lots of organizations with tweets in 990s. So I think when we talk about the work, it's important that we know the information we're getting. And this is the first conversation we've had about these numbers, which I've heard repeated over and over again in this committee and others. And so I think it is important to understand and understand the questions, as in, why, if the OLA report says $6 million, are we putting $100 million in the in a tracker that then gets repeated? What I will ask, I actually wanted to go back to something because I think there is something you and I agree on when we're talking about should government and should, as we provide services, what does it mean when we're providing those services through nonprofits? Doesn't stop at for nonprofits. You said private, the public benefits corporations, private vendors. In all of those cases, I think the point you make is, and I think it's a good question to ask, is that the most efficient? Is that the most transparent? Is that the way that we can and should provide those services? And I think that question is raised when we think about, as we think about feeding our future, which was a pandemic era one-time grant, and how it differs actually from our school meals program. One is delivered directly through government, through our school districts, through the schools that are providing meals, and another, as you spent a lot of time describing, and as we've seen both in the news and in the prosecutions, was not just nonprofits and for-profit providers, but also nonprofit oversight of those nonprofit and for-profit providers. And so thinking about those structures, I think, as you brought up, I think is an important thing as we think about the best way to both protect the benefits that folks should be getting, that we as policymakers have decided, whether it's childcare or food or housing or whatever it is, and ensuring that we're protecting those resources that provide for those meals. So I think that that's a worthwhile question to ask. I think we have been having it of how we're providing, whether it's grants, funds, or directly through government. But I just, to say that, that's not something we spent a lot of time talking about here, but I appreciate that. My question is actually also on this tracker, something we haven't talked about yet. And I just had a few questions about where the numbers are coming from. Looking at number 4, the frontline worker bonus pay, wondering where you got that $45 million number and what it stands for.
Mr. Glenn.
Madam Chair, Representative, so again, that's another OLA report on the frontline worker pay. And again, back to Representative Pinto's point, when there's many numbers in a report, what do you pick? And so I tried to pick the number here that represented something close, that matched closest to the idea of fraud, waste, and abuse, money that shouldn't have gone out the door. The program itself was much larger. And again, the OLA had a lot of criticisms, which I don't know if they have merit or not, about the haste in which the program was implemented, the perhaps lack of direction from the legislature about the parameters of the program. I understood in the context of COVID-19, the urging of the everyone involved, the Department of Labor, the state legislature, the governor, trying to get the money out the door as quickly as possible. And when that's your goal, sometimes corners are cut. Sometimes people who got money who weren't necessarily eligible for it. It was a self-reporting system. As I've said, much of state government is on the honor system. We assume that everybody's operating in good faith until proven otherwise. And so the source of my document is the source cited in the bibliography page.
Thank you. Representative Greenman.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate that. I'm looking at the 16 and 17 of the OLA report. I sit along with Representative Anderson on the Audit Commission, and so know this intimately. I was also on the conference committee that passed the bipartisan agreement that brought in unemployment, the refilling the unemployment trust fund, as well as this frontline worker pay. And one thing I will just say for folks who didn't follow that is there was, and particularly in the methodology of this report, one of the biggest, and that DLI raised, that I raised as somebody on the conference committee, that the bill author raised, folks in both bodies, was that there were some very intentional policy choices made about, and when we talk about the eligibility numbers, the problem with the OLA's report, the problem with that 9.1% number is that required employer verification, which is what the OLA did in their audit. But in the bill that we passed in the legislature, we very specifically rejected amendments and rejected employer verification because of what we're worried about, which actually showed up in the OLA report, which was employers either wouldn't respond, which a third of the folks who got the surveys just didn't respond. And we didn't want to prevent these nurses and frontline workers, these grocery store workers, these folks from the 16-month delay that the OLA report took 16 months for 300 surveys. So there was a policy choice that we made for 2 of the 6 eligibility criteria. So the government, DEED and DLI and DOR verified a whole set of things, identity and whether they got UI, whether their adjusted gross income, all of these things. What they didn't and what government couldn't verify was that they spent that 120 hours in close proximity. And that was what the legislation asked for self-attestation. The challenge of the OLA report, and I don't know if you got a chance to watch I think we had a 2-hour hearing about it, or listen to some of that, but the problem was by using an employer verification and then calling that, making an eligibility determination, that's actually was inaccurate with what the legislature passed. Now, you can take issue with what the legislature passed, but that's not either the role of the OLA or this, or the sort of after the fact. The question I have is why you chose, so there was a couple of different, I think in reflection of the OLA's, I think, some of the feedback about the employer survey methodology. They did 3 projections. They did a projection that accepts employer surveys as accurate and says, if there's a disagreement with the employer and the employee, it doesn't matter, the employer's right. There is a projection that does not accept the employer surveys as accurate, which reflects the will of the legislature and what we put in the bill, which does not require employer verification. And then there was a projection number 3, which was sort of split the baby and said, for places where the feedback between the employer and the employee when the question is about whether the 120 hours was in close proximity, we're going to take that out because that's probably something the workers know best about. I'm wondering why you chose, it looks like you chose the top number, and why you decided to choose that as opposed to the other two numbers.
Mr. Glenn?
Madam Chair, Representative, yeah, again, you have this report. I forgot how many pages it is. It's a voluminous report. I didn't want to leave readers of the tracker with the impression that the entire program was fraud. That certainly wasn't true, and the LLA's report supports much of the good work the Department of Labor did. But much of it, whether it was done in haste or without clear direction, or they misinterpreted the direction that you believe you had clearly given to them, I want to put a number that I felt accurately captured perhaps not fraud so much as the waste and abuse of the program. And that's the number I chose and listed in my endnotes.
Thank you. Last question. We have two more people and we need to wind it up. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I think we spent an hour not asking any questions to try to make sure that we got and sort of could dig in. I would say that's sort of my concern with the slogan of waste, fraud, and abuse is we know what fraud is, and we're seeing it, whether it's prosecuted or whether it's using the tools that we've talked sort of voluminously about, the Attorney General, the Inspectors General here in Minnesota, the U.S. Attorney, but we know what that is. The waste and abuse seems to be, and when I heard you say it's sort of the closest thing, the 9.1 number is the closest thing to the waste, fraud, and abuse. What the 9.1 number is saying that, one, we do not and accept the self-verification that the legislature passed, and also if there's a dispute between the worker and the employer, we're going to take the employer's work for it. I don't know if you followed up with the DLI, but they actually reached out to some of those employers who said things like, no, they weren't in 120, they didn't spend that time in close proximity because they had to wear a mask. Clearly not the legislative intent or letter of the law. I will say that there is a number in here that talks about fraud indicators, and that's 0.2%. And what DLI said in their letter was that's probably an accurate or as close to an accurate number. Now, 22%, any fraud is too much. But what we know, and if you look at, and I'm sure in all your deep diving, if you look at private industry, if you look at folks who do this, 0 is not a number anyone has. There is across the board, as we think about markets, we think about targeting senior citizens, we think about small businesses, fraud as a target, as a mark, government in this case is the mark. And so 0.2% is a number that I think is around where industry standard is. The thing I will say, and the thing that makes this very hard is like $45 million is part of this $610 million. And what it sounds like under this slogan of waste, fraud, and abuse, and this happens with my colleagues across the aisle too, is that it's just an opportunity to, this policy that you don't like, I get it. We sit here and there's some bills we like, some bills we don't like. That doesn't make it waste and abuse. That just makes it something you disagree with. And I think that the challenge with any of these numbers, like the 100 million, the 41 or 45 million, all of the other numbers on this chart feel like they have been cherry-picked, and in some cases I would call this a misrepresentation. We might disagree on that, and putting it under this slogan of waste, fraud, and abuse, and especially looking at, and I know we're talking about where this coming from doesn't matter, but I had not been really familiar with the organization, or you, but I did check Twitter, and it doesn't feel like it's your tweets, calling the governor a fraud, you are a fraud, and every post my estimate of your IQ drops another point. Like the thing that I want to make sure we're doing here is actually taking seriously the how do we protect people, how do we protect the services and the resources for those services, and how do we make sure that we harden government as a mark. And what this $610 million with 100 million in CCAP, that's just, the closest thing you could find. 45 million, which is the closest, I think I wrote down, the closest thing to race, fraud, and abuse. You started naming policies you don't like, maybe MNLARS or MNSure, or we heard about Southwest Rail, whatever it is. We should have a policy conversation about what and how government serves people, but to lump in, and we see this happening at the federal level, to lump in everything arbitrarily and cherry-picked that folks don't like and call it waste, fraud, and abuse as a political tool is neither going to serve people, it's not going to make us deliver our services better, and it certainly won't get to the problem of provider fraud that we have been talking about, and I think that the AG and the governor have been really focused on, and that we have a governor's package about. So I guess that I would leave my comments at that
Thank
this
you.
is a number that's very hard to
Do you have a
substantiate.
brief response, Mr. Glenn? Otherwise, I want to move on here.
I know you want to move on, Madam Chair, but it reminded me of something I wrote in my written remarks. I don't think I said out loud, was just to the point of trying to do due diligence. So we have the Personal Care Assistance Program, again, another $1 billion program. It has over 40,000 clients, 40,000, and for some families, this is life-saving, where you have a disabled child at home and you want to keep the family together. You don't want to put this child in a facility, but you're able to do that because you have personal care assistants who are able to, with some state subsidy, come into your home and take care of your, whether it's a elderly person or a child with disabilities. It is life-saving. You have 40,000 clients, and depending on the source you cite for the number of people who are available to provide that service, 100,000 to 200,000. By some measures, it's the #1 profession in the state of Minnesota. More than public school teachers, more than nurses, more than some other people who working professions you would imagine to be much larger. And if you are the State Department in charge of overseeing the program, how on earth do you police or manage 40,000 work sites and 100 to 200,000 providers? Well, you do the best you can. So to the point of the tracker, and what I'm trying to accomplish here is put a spotlight on waste, fraud, and abuse. Again, I'm sorry I wasted so much time or spent so much time at the beginning trying to figure out what the real number is for the Feeding Our Future, because it's not this number. So for every prosecution you have for fraud in the state, how much fraud have you missed? Have you gotten half of it? Have you gotten a tenth of it? And what we've heard from Feeding Our Future is the best example where I have spent years studying it. We have 70 people indicted, most of them have pled guilty or been convicted. The Department of Justice has cited there are probably another 200 to 300 people who have been investigated who still might be indicted at some point. Nobody's saying we got it all. And so to suggest that not only have we not had a goal, oh no, you overshot the mark, that the actual amount of waste, fraud, and abuse in Minnesota state government is much smaller than what I presented here, biased or not, I don't think I can agree.
Representative Schultz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And it's been just a fascinating discussion this morning to kind of hear, I think for the first time, at least this year, a moment where it appears like the DFL in this body is more focused upon either saying that there wasn't any fraud or trying to dispute the numbers rather than to admit that the state of Minnesota has had the largest fraud anywhere in the country over the last several years. And that's just of the fraud that we know. I mean, I appreciate Mr. Glahn coming here today because in case the members were too focused on the other side of the aisle on trying to dispute his numbers and dispute the different things, he brought countless different ideas that I know members around this table brought up that we haven't yet considered, that should be considered during this legislature. So I'm curious. I mean, I know that Governor Walz has tried to cover up the fraud, but is that what's happening right now within the DFL caucus? Because right now with the things that we've heard, you know, we've had instances where he's saying, you know, should we have nonprofits, as an example, have a full tax year before they're eligible? Should they be registered with the Attorney General? In essence, providing greater oversight through the Attorney General. Mr. Glahn has also said, should we be enhancing the role of the state auditor? If you go back to the founding of our state, the state auditor would have had a lot of these controls in place that at some points have probably been peeled away from them. I mean, he has offered countless different examples of things that we should be considering. So I just want to say, instead of covering up fraud, this committee should continue our focus to ensure that we are exposing more and fixing the problem in our fraud prevention committee. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair Anderson.
Thank you, and I'll be brief too. I'm going to comment on a couple things. Representative Greenman mentioned, just briefly touched on some thoughts about if we're going to provide state services, maybe we need to do more through state government rather than through some of these NGOs and nonprofits. And actually, I tend to agree with you on that. So, because we have seen huge problems as we hire, well, I call them vendors, but whether they're nonprofits or they're, businesses, it's been a huge problem. And I also want to quickly touch waste, fraud, and abuse. Waste and abuse are, as I've been saying in the OIG meetings, that they're subjective somewhat. I would argue that this number is way too low if we're going to include waste and abuse, and probably way too low if we're going to include fraud. It's, we can't, it's disingenuous to say that the only fraud that occurred is that which has been prosecuted, because we know it's much more than we prosecuted, and we know it's significantly higher. And I also want to point out that the Southwest Light Rail is not on this fraud tracker, and I absolutely think it should be if it's under waste. That's several $1 billion that would, exponentially increase this number. So it's bad, but I think most of us here want to do something about it. We want to find a solution, and I thank you for bringing some of your ideas. I do want to mention in regards to the OIG bill, I mean, we're still looking at option, but the House OIG bill has the Inspector General under the legislature, parallel to the legislative auditor. The Senate OIG bill has arguably within the executive branch, but actually under the sort of a group that would be created of legislators, House, Senate members, and under an administrative law judge. We all know this cannot be under the governor. We all know that. And we're not talking any specific governor, but under the governors. That, it has failed being within, where you have little agency OIGs that have answered to commissioners who were appointed by the governor, appointed by commissioners, and that has failed. So we're trying to find an alternative, and I know there's several people on this committee that are helping work with that, and so any ideas you have are appreciated. So I know we have just a few minutes, and I'll wrap it up, so.
Yes, thank you. And I have to leave, so Vice Chair Anderson, I will turn the committee over to you, and Representative Elkins, you're up. Please keep it brief. Thank you.
I'll be very brief. So one of my favorite quotes, and you're probably familiar with this one, is that if you torture the data long enough, it will confess, from the economist Ronald Coase. And, my big concern about the tracker is that, there's a lot of cherry picking of the numbers in here, as we've been discussing. And the bottom line on this is that it's conveying a misimpression that there's over $600 million to be gained that could be potentially applied against closing the future budget deficit, and that's just not the case. A lot of these programs are one-time. The vast majority of this money is actually federal money, not that we should care any less about it, but if the impression is being conveyed here is that all we have to do is eliminate fraud and we can balance the budget, we're doing ourselves a horrible disservice. About a week ago, I bumped into a veteran Capitol reporter in the hall, and the reporter asked me about the status of my zoning reform bills, but while I had him, I took the opportunity to, ask about his further interest in covering our committee. And that reporter just chuckled and said to me, no, as soon as I read the Bondi letter, I just realized that this was just going to be another dog and pony show. So if the Bondi letter was Exhibit A, I think this tracker is Exhibit B. And I'm looking forward to the time that with this committee can kind of get past the grandstanding and actually dig into some of the policy prescriptions that we ought to be considering. Because as I'm reading all of these reports that we're all reading, there's lots of good ideas in there on how to address this stuff. And I'm a wonk, you guys know that. I love digging into the solutions, and I want us to get to that point as quickly as we can.
Thank you. Representative Pinto?
Thank you, Madam
for
Chair. And
closing.
yeah, thank you. And I'll keep this shorter, I know, because the chair is out and you're filling in. But I'll just say that when I saw this on the agenda, I was skeptical, I'll admit, but I want to make sure to come in listen with an open mind. And what it seems to me that we found in the questioning and looking at this document is that there is, in fact, what I heard is trying to push a particular agenda. And we only looked at a couple of lines in detail, line 2 and line 4, and found that those were numbers that had been chosen. In fact, in the case of line 2, had been identified in the legislative order as being wrong. But the idea is, well, we have to include some sort of number apparently to achieve a particular purpose. And I guess I just want to recognize we've just spent an entire hearing from someone who was looking at reports and then providing information to us. It's especially important that we be able to rely on the accuracy of the information that we receive. If we're going to address fraud, and we need to address fraud, it should be with real facts and real numbers with people who have real expertise. That has been sorely lacking. It has been sorely lacking here. And agreed, we want to talk about specific proposals in 5 weeks in the committee. That has not happened yet. I hope that it will happen. I don't want to get into more of that with the chair gone. But I really do want to say it is absolutely critical that we rely on actual accurate information in the work that we are doing. And when we are not doing that, the definition of fraud, deception that is wrongful and results in gain, this is a deception. Like, I don't want anybody to say $610 million ever again. $100 million is wrong, the total is wrong, and it is intended to achieve a goal and result in gain, political gain. That is fraud. What has just happened here has been fraud, members. And so let's not have, I hope this is the last time this committee or any other serves as a conduit for deceptive information from the center of the American experiment. This should be the last time. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Representative Pinto, I want to remind, the title on that is Fraud, Waste, and Abuse. And if we are going to define this, okay, as only things that have been prosecuted and convicted, okay, that's one different thing. I would, again, argue fraud, waste, and abuse. I think everyone knows in the state of Minnesota that it's many, many, many times higher than the $600 million that is on this. So that's it, and we're adjourned. So thank you.